That's a good idea. Okay. As you all know, I think first and foremost, we know our water is in there, comes from there, and needs all of our protection. So Mr. Enright has been very gracious to come and meet with us in answer to our letter, and he said he considers this a fact-finding mission.
I'm pleased to be here, and committed to Bridget. I will be back several times if necessary and work with you on this situation. So thank you all.
It's been my pleasure to have visited New Zealand on two occasions. First time was way back in 1961, back when there were like 2 million people and 20 million sheep. And that was the business of New Zealand, grazing sheep and selling wool and selling lamb products around the world. In 2008, a little history lesson here. There was a big scandal in China. Contamination of the milk supply in China resulted in 300,000 infants getting sick and half a dozen or so fatalities. It got to the point of where no self-respecting Chinese mother would allow her kid to drink locally produced milk because it was so contaminated. So what do? They still want the milk products. They start importing it. And New Zealand says, hey, we can do that. There's a lot more money in selling whole dried milk product to China than there is in growing sheep. And you know, this is called agribusiness, and the second half of that word is business, and businessmen are out for profits. So they geared up to increase their exports in a big way, and they went from like 46,000 tons exported to China in 2008 to, in 2013, just 5 years later, from 46,000 to 619,000 tons. And they're fat, dumb, and happy until they wake up a few years later and realize what they have done to their environment. And it is sick. It is a mess. Their freshwater environment has been ruined as a result of over-intensive dairy farming. They've enacted legislation to try to clean it up. It's going to be a long time before they get enough remedial action done to restore the health of that environment. Now, I do have a financial background, so I won't bore you with too much of the history of the business side of the milk business, but basically we're all consumers here, and we buy milk, and you can get it at your local supermarket, and the milk that's produced by the local processor, and there is only one, Meadow Gold, sells for $7.98 a gallon at Big Save, which is owned by Times Market. Walmart beats them by a couple of cents. It sells it at $7.96. Now, it comes in the same 1 gallon jug as other milks there that come from the mainland. And Big Save sells a brand called Dairyland, and it's mainland milk. They sell it for $5.68. Interestingly, Dairyland is a subsidiary of Dean Foods, which is the company that owns Meadow Gold. Safeway sells its Lucerne private label stuff for $5.68. Doesn't handle Meadow Gold. Walmart kicks it down to $4.80. And the winner is Costco at $4.69 a gallon. So you can buy your Meadow Gold at $7.98, or you can buy your Costco at $4.69. By the way, that's the retail price of milk. Back in 1980, the farmer got 50% of that went to the farmer. Now, what with all the middlemen taking a slice here, there, and whatever, and transportation, the farmer is only getting about 1/3 of the retail price of milk. The rotational grazing method that Hawaii Dairy Farm sort of latched onto and is trying to pattern itself after is really not a panacea. It is what they envisioned was a partial solution to the high cost of importing feed grains for dairy cattle, because we don't grow a lot of forage around here that is used for dairy feed. We don't have vast acreage of corn or soybeans and stuff that they feed to cattle. So they figured, well, we'll just get them to eat the grass and we'll move them from this pasture to this pasture. And the consequences are just as evil as in the confined animal processes that are used on the mainland for intensive industrial scale dairy production. So just to wind it up, this big boom in milk prices resulted in a peak of about $5,000 a ton, and it was participated in to take advantage of that peak price by New Zealand, by the U.S. as well, and by the Aussies and anybody else that could export dairy products to China and other nations in Southeast Asia like Thailand and all who wanted to improve their diets. That's resulted in some oversupply of milk, and now prices have tumbled, and now they're back down to about $1,900 a ton. But it's still called white gold in some circles, maybe not as glittery as it used to be, but if they think that Hawaii dairy farms, that they have the perfect solution for clean farming in the New Zealand model, they better think again. I've got case after case of litigation, suits, fines, problems that have arisen in New Zealand because of the industrialization of the dairies on a huge scale.
Thanks, everyone. And for those of you who want to, you can go to our website. We also have reports from the Independent Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment in New Zealand, who describes nearly 60% of New Zealand's water as being not potable from water degradation. We're moving on now to soil at the proposed site, and that was important because the issue of runoff, and I have a soil person here to help with that too, who can explain it, but the issue of runoff apparently becomes more of an issue because of the type of soil at Maha'ulepu. Maha'ulepu has a very large part of its property with a high clay component. And one of the things that came out as we were looking at this, Mr. Enright, was that when the plan was filed with the state, it was originally called a conservation plan. That was prepared in November of 2013. Several of us went down and met with Sina Pruder because there weren't waste loads, there wasn't the calculation of the manure, there wasn't even a way to determine what was going to impact the environment. And I spoke personally with Peter Townsend, the head of the West Kauai Soil and Water Conservation District, and he explained that they really weren't qualified to make calculations on what was a safe amount of manure for soil. They're a volunteer board, 2 appointees, and that's not in their expertise. And part of the difficulty with this whole operation is we don't really have factory farming in Hawaii yet. And so even the Omidyars have publicly used the term test dairy, referring to the Maha'ulepu dairy. And we feel it's really a bad place to run a test. But when we looked at the soil, we first had no soil studies at all when the original plan was filed in the end of 2013. It turns out we met with the state in April of 2014. They gave the plan back to the dairy farm and said, this is not a waste management plan. You need to come back with a waste management plan. Why is that important? Well, not only did it not have waste loads or the information on the effluent ponds or the amounts of gallons that were going to be irrigating or the regularity with which they irrigate, but the plan didn't give a sense of what was going to happen to the environment. But yet that's the only plan that was ever reviewed by West Kauai Soil and Water Conservation District. And I think that's really important because the dairy got, and they proudly say, an exemption for their grubbing and grading permit. They didn't get that exemption for any or after any government official has looked at their waste management plan that actually details the waste. The first one was filed in redacted form in May of 2014 with the State Department of Health, and then later a final was filed July 23rd, 2014. When it was filed in July, there was a report included from Spectrum Analytics, and it would appear that the dairy did the soil studies early in April of 2014. Before that time, they actually were referring to the soil at Maha'ulepu, and they told us in meetings in February of 2014 that it was free-draining volcanic soil. And I have those pages, which I'll present to you, Mr. Enright, that are in print, where they refer to it as free-draining volcanic soil. We didn't know about the Natural Resource Conservation Services report of June 2014. The dairy didn't identify it in their July plan to the state. Instead, they enclosed the Spectrum Analytics findings. What we did find later, through a report of an engineer with CH2M Hill on Oahu, was that the Spectrum Analytics report was far less detailed than what was in the Natural Resource Conservation Service report. The Natural Resource Conservation Service divided the exact farm site into sectors. They called it a custom soil resource report. It was done at the request of someone looking exactly at the dairy site, wanting the federal government, a division of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, to analyze the soils on that farm. And they've concluded that approximately 62% of the soils on the farm were not well suited for a land-based application of animal waste. And that was a critical finding by the NRCS, because this farm is purportedly a zero discharge farm. Others will speak to that. But they're saying that every ounce of manure, every urine excreted, all of it is going to stay on the 517 grazing acres. That's the total grazing pasture area. That's right out of their plan. That means that the soils either have to absorb it, or it's going to pond and pool and run off. And one of the things that Mark Madison called out, the engineer from CH2M Hill, is that the dairy really doesn't reference, nor does their Spectrum Analytics company reference ponding or pooling of the soil. So Mr. Madison took the soil findings and noted that 62% have heavy clay component, do not drain well. The manure solids, the irrigation of effluent back onto the pasture is going to tend to sit. And the dairy also filed a report, which I'll give to Mr. Enright, with the Department of Health, wherein they said that they admitted that the manure is an inefficient form of fertilization, and it is, because it's not cured. It's fresh. It's basically fresh fertilizer. So it'll sit on the ground, and it'll provide a grass crop with 20% of its nutrient need, because until it cures and breaks down and becomes actually absorbable to the grass, which a process that most farmers say takes at least 9 months, it can't be taken up by the grass. So it's going to sit there. And the dairy said 80% of the fertilization is going to have to be added to the crop with imported fertilizers. So when we talk about the nitrate load and the concern of nitrate getting in the water, it isn't just from the animal manure, it's also going to be 80% of their fertilization is going to be through supplementation or imported fertilizer, which means nitrates, compounding nitrates. And in the studies that I know Cornelia Boyle did, there are areas where irrigation has carried nitrates from ag farms using too much fertilizer and have ruined potable water. So this is just as much a form of nitrate as the animal waste is. But the animal waste is going to sit there for a while, and there's someone else who will talk about that. Let me check my notes. I think I pretty much covered my topic, but we've got 62% high clay-based, small area of absorbability, and we've got this issue of the groundwater, the aquifers, and the natural springs in the area. And this whole area is an area where water accumulates and fills our wells from. In fact, one thing I think Eileen saw too when we went down to the county and met with the Department of Health officials was that their actual diagram, they put a diagram on top of the dairy's map, right, Eileen? And they identified what they called the well capture or recharge zone. And the line went into the actual block H where the manure solids are going to be pumped. And so the pumped solids are going to sit right above the well capture zone.
But I thought I would pick up on the fertilizer and manure and that part of the subject. The flies and odors, any of us can recognize that problem. But the silent one is the nitrates that Bridget mentioned. The dairy people talk about zero discharge, and I don't think there's really anything that can be classified as zero discharge. They try to tell us that the cow eats the grass, then he poops on the grass picks up the poop as fertilizer, and it's a perfect circle. But that's not how it works. Manure contains, as its nitrogen form, primarily ammonium. And ammonium doesn't always stay as ammonium. It has a positive charge, and it will connect with clay particles. But then it goes through a process when temperatures are over 50 degrees, and in 2 or 3 days, it goes through this process and it changes to nitrate. Nitrate has a negative charge, and it will not attach to clay particles as ammonium, and it stays in what we call the soil solution. It's moving with moisture within the soil. And that's the form that is really a major concern, because through irrigation, through heavy rainfall, it can be moved to drainage ditches, streams, eventually into water wells, where it has been found in many cases. In modern day, there's new analytical procedures that have been developed that can pick up all types of things in water at depths that we never thought any of these things would be down in those situations. So, so that's the concern. And then when it moves around, it can get in the ocean or wherever it might be. It has a direct effect on the plant or algae type of growth. It can disrupt the ratio of the plants that are naturally in those areas, that causes a disruption in plant life, fish situations, etc. But the big concern is in the water wells, and these wells are real close to the proposed project. The NRCS report pretty much spelled out that they don't recommend this area for a dairy. I couldn't help the gentleman that talked about New Zealand. I nodded my head when he said that it was referred to there as white gold, which I'm aware of, and their tourism is directed a lot to fishing, and evidently, from what I hear, is that the dairy contamination has really wrecked some of their promotional effects for that area. So here they're going to spray on the diluted manure. It's going to be held in some holding ponds, and it'll be sprayed out. And the winds that we all know that we have here are going to move minute particles of that for a lot of distance. And it's also going to be, they're not going to get rid of the odor at all. So I guess my feeling is why place a dairy in an area that is upwind from an an area that is pristine and supports many, many families, people with their employment, the hotels. It just, common sense seems like that's not the place for it. Thank you.
Kaua'i Dairy Farms proposes to be a zero discharge operation. This is impossible to do. From everything that has already been said, the very nature of the operation includes discharges to lagoons, runoff from the dairy washing operations, and hundreds and eventually thousands of discharges from the animals on the land. And together, they will have an accumulative effect, as has already been discussed, on our groundwater, surface water, the beaches, caves, everything downstream. Also to consider this to be a non-point pollution issue is another misnomer. For every contaminant, there is a point source. There always is. It's just often difficult to find where it's coming from and who's responsible. Science, however, more and more is on our side, and through use of DNA techniques, etc., we're discovering better ways to sort that out. Obtaining an NPDES zero discharge permit is not useful. And in this case, in my estimation, is patently deceiving to the public. It implies that there will be no discharges. And I had many people, when they saw that in the newspaper, say, oh, a zero discharge permit, that means no discharges. No, it only means that the operation will not be directly discharging into waters of the United States from a designated point. It does not reflect the hundreds and eventually thousands of point sources that will be on the site. As has clearly been demonstrated by EPA and the affected citizens in eastern Washington, accumulation of dairy waste can and does contaminate drinking water wells. Unfortunately, it took decades and a great deal of money provided by your tax dollars to figure that out. The state didn't do it. EPA had to come in and use Superfund hazardous waste dollars to drill those sampling wells and to do the analysis. And that information now is public, and it's being used by private citizens to sue those dairies because they can't drink their water. And there's the many health issues involved, including blue baby syndrome. In my mind, there's only two reasons that the Hawaii Dairy Federation, HDF, would apply for a zero discharge permit. One, I believe, is to convince the public into thinking there will be no discharges, which I have already said, and other people have here also, that that's not possible. The other reason is that under federal law, and I don't know about Hawaiian law, but if a dairy has a zero discharge permit, they are allowed legally under a massive storm event to discharge. That's pretty scary too, because we know on this island we have had some pretty massive storm water events. So in conclusion, zero discharge is not possible, and there's no good reason really for the dairy to even seek a zero discharge permit other than for the reason I just mentioned. Thank you.
I think you've been presented with science, and I find that very impressive. That's not my area of expertise, but I find what was presented here very convincing. I think there's not a worse place that could have been picked to put this dairy, and to me, that's evident. I think there are other places it could be put on Kauai where it does not affect the water. It does not affect a close by community. This is not people saying, oh, not in my backyard. They're concerned about environmental factors. We are very committed and determined on this issue. And the bottom line is the best thing that could happen to Maha'ulepu would be either for the federal government, the state government, to make it a state park, federal park, a land trust get it, and preserve it for all the citizens of Kauai. But we're adamantly against a dairy in Maha'ulepu. Thank you.
Even though this isn't work that the department's historically done weighing in at this level, the governor's asked me to do just that. So I'll take the information that you've all presented, thank you very much, and the governor's asked me to do scientific inquiry. He's asked me to take a look at it, find out, you know, if in fact these critiques hold, and to weigh back in with Ulupona. It is my understanding, and it still holds, to tell you where we're at and what my discussions with Ulupona were like, and we'll take it from there. I mean, if we had groups like this all over the state, we would be much better off. This is democracy in action. So.